House. Dr Megan Woods.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I'm very pleased to take a call on the Student Loan Scheme Amendment Bill number 3. Because, Mr Speaker, hot on the heels of Budget 2012 and the fantastic plan from the National Party to tax paperboys, Budget 2013 delivered us the arrest amid the borders of the students measure. And this, Mr Speaker, is simply a gimmick that is not going to achieve what the bill purports to set out as its purpose. We've heard the tired old rhetoric of the national members opposite that tell us this is about making the student loan scheme sustainable into the future, that it's about people taking personal responsibility, and it's about fairness. Mr Speaker, this is simply not true. This is a piece of legislation that is not going to do anything to achieve the aims that it sets out to do. It is a gimmick for the National Party to try and look tough to their constituents. But, Mr Speaker, the interest-free student loan scheme was one of the great achievements of the Clark-led Labor government. It removed the punitive and unsustainable interest charges from student loans, which became increasingly impractical and generationally unfair in terms of how we funded tertiary education. And, Mr Speaker, the braying from the members opposite underlines exactly what this piece of legislation is about. This is about a government that knows literally that they cannot unpick a piece of legislation wholesale that they don't like. In fact, in this debate, Mr Speaker, we've heard the member for Tamaki, Mr O'Connor, calling over the House, the member for Tamaki, Mr O'Connor, calling across the House that the interest-free student loan scheme that Labor instituted when last in government was nothing but a gimmick. And this cuts to the heart of what this legislation is about. This is about a government so desperate to cling to power that it won't do what it really wants to do, and that is to do away with the interest-free student loan scheme. They don't like the fact that actually it is the opposite to the elitist view of education that they hold in the tertiary sector, that it allows greater access for people to go to university and to enter into tertiary education. They don't like this. So what we have seen over the last 5 years in government, Mr Speaker, is instead they've chipped away. We have the ridiculous measures in the Student Loan Scheme Amendment Bill number 3 that we're currently debating. We've had the restriction of the Student Loan Scheme to the number of New Zealanders who can access this scheme. And, Mr Speaker, this exposes one of the fundamental differences between our side of the House and the Labor Party and the government opposite. Because on this side of the House and the Labor Party, we believe that tertiary education is an investment in our country's future. That tertiary education is the way in which we will transform our economy. Having an educated workforce is something that we want to open up and something we encourage. We do not see tertiary education as a cost to be cut. And that is how members opposite view tertiary education. And the legislation that we have before us is yet another example of how the government views tertiary education. But, Mr Speaker, we've had other speakers in this debate stand up and tell you about how this gimmick, these punitive measures that they think is going to bring in the additional revenue. It's going to make the scheme fair and it's going to make it sustainable, because we'll get those, to use those words, those shirking students overseas to pay what they owe. Well, Mr Speaker, we in the Labor Party do not disagree on the principle that those people that have borrowed money from the student loan scheme should pay it back. We disagree with the government, however, that when we're going to introduce measures to increase payment on the student loan scheme, they should actually work. And as we've heard from the member who spoke before me, official after official have told this government that the measures contained in this legislation will not work. Treasury have told them it's not going to work. The police have told them it's nigh on impossible for them to arrest them at the borders. It's simply not going to work. And then they've had advice from the Legislative Advisory Committee that this is not going to work. The government is not interested in looking at measures and real practical solutions that will and have been shown to increase the collection of student loans, and not focused on gimmick policies. So if we have a look in 2008, what the Labour-led government did then, that an amnesty was introduced for student loan borrowers who had fallen behind on their payments. In the short period of time that amnesty was open, 13,000 borrowers signed up with the IRD and entered into a payment agreement with the government. This is the kind of measure that we on this side of the House want to see. We want to see solutions that work, solutions that actually do allow the shukers, as the government calls them, to actually start repaying their loans and not be kept out of their own country. Because, Mr. Speaker, we don't see these people as shukers. We see them as young New Zealanders that actually we want to encourage to make a contribution to this country. We don't want to exclude them from New Zealand and set in stone the fact that they are never going to come back here. They're not going to share the fruits of their education. They're not going to share the fruits of the valuable experiences that they have experienced overseas. We only have to hear the nasty and arrogant and out-of-touch reaction to the very personal stories that members of this House have told about people who have contacted them, who have tried to enter into negotiations with IRD. Those talks have broken down, and know that now those people cannot re-enter New Zealand despite trying to enter into repayment agreements. The reactions from the other side of the House show that this is a government that is more interested in demonising young New Zealanders than finding real solutions for how we can address this issue. How is it that we can get more people paying back the student loan money that they owe? And if we have a look at some of the other measures that this bill does in terms of if you are a young New Zealander living overseas, the bill increases the repayment rates for overseas borrowers. It takes absolutely no allowance of the amount of income. So if you're earning £150,000, you'll be paying the same back as someone who earns £25,000 if your loan balance is over 50,000 New Zealand dollars. Now, Mr. Speaker, this is not the kind of progressive way we in New Zealand are used to addressing debt. This is not the progressive way in which the student loan scheme has been set out. But this legislation is so very national. There's no evidence that it will increase compliance, and we have not heard one speaker from the government get up and tell us how it is going to increase compliance. Instead, we have heard tired old rhetoric about sustainable student loan scheme. We know the government doesn't like the interest-free loan scheme, so to stand up and tell us this is in the interest of protecting a scheme that their members cannot control themselves about heckling about how bad it is just absolute bumpkin. It makes absolutely no sense. We know that that is not what they are trying to do. It's not going to work, it's not going to achieve its aim, and it is yet more evidence of a government that is not interested in connecting the dots of what we can achieve as a nation if we truly do invest in our education system. If we see education as something more than a cost to be cut, if we see the kind of country we can be with more people in tertiary education and not have policies in place that explicitly set to exclude New Zealanders from undertaking tertiary education. It is with pleasure I have finished this speech setting out why it is that Labour will not be supporting this legislation.
David Bennett.
Mr. Speaker.